But very good to see you all. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first webinar we've had in a while. Actually, it's been a gap in the Common Awards webinar schedule. There will be a couple more coming next term, which we'll advertise, including we'll be holding a webinar for feedback on the academic misconduct policy in relation to AI. That will be coming up in March. So we're not focusing on that this morning. This morning is focused on matters of assessment. But it's my very great pleasure to welcome Candace Nolan-Grant, who is going to be leading us this morning, who works in Durham in the Centre for Academic Development here, and who's been working on these matters around the university for some time. So I'm just going to switch the spotlight and hand over to Candace, who's going to lead us through most of this morning.
Thank you very much. Right, hopefully you can see the PowerPoint now. I have included a handful of images generated by AI and the prompts that I use. This is mostly for some kind of perspective on the capabilities and limitations of AI in single images. I have been working in DCAD since its formation. Some of you might recognize me from the Associate Fellowship course that we run online for Common Awards tutors. And in fact, before I joined the university a very long time ago, I worked for the predecessor of the Common Awards as well. So thank you all for coming along this morning. I'm going to talk about generative AI and assessment design in particular. I'll introduce quickly a framework for thinking about generative AI and assessment that's been helpful over the past couple of years. I'll look briefly at what current research and thinking have to say about assessment design in light of generative AI. A couple short case studies from Durham University, but the main goal of the session is to prime you with some information and latest thinking for hopefully a fruitful discussion. You can definitely plenty of time to ask me questions about what I've said, but hopefully a great deal of time for you to think about your teaching, your modules, your assessments, what you might be doing or be thinking about doing in the future to respond in a positive and pedagogically robust way to generative AI. So this is the framework that we've been using. Yes, I will share the slides, absolutely. There'll be a load of links to further resources and research, so absolutely, I'll share them. Yeah. So this framework came out early in 2023. And as you see, the first response is to ignore generative AI and hope it goes away. I think we can all agree that that's probably not going to be a viable response in the long term now. The next response was to prohibit its use in coursework, full stop. In the short term, there's no reliable way to enforce this unless it's absolutely blatant. For example, the student copies their prompt to ChatGPT in it along with their essay response, or the ChatGPT response, "Thank you for asking for your essay, here it is." Apart from obvious things like that, there's no reliable way to enforce it. Detectors seem to be a possibility for a while, but testing proved that they weren't reliable. They had both false negatives and false positives. And in the medium term, it would be an arms race in the sense that generative AI tools would get better, and then detectors would struggle to keep up, and it would just be a never-ending race. There are also tools that at least claim to be able to fix generative AI output so it isn't detected. So in the long term, that doesn't necessarily seem to be viable. then, the answer to a lot of people seemed to be, to go back entirely to in-person assessments. And Durham are thinking about this in terms of pedagogical appropriateness. So I'll give you a brief explanation of how Durham University is thinking about this. Obviously, your institutions might be thinking about it differently, and that, so absolutely fine. But just for an indication of what the accrediting body is thinking of it. Now we're thinking at the level of program assessment and using in-person assessments for foundational program learning outcomes. And of course, the big question there is, what is a foundational program learning outcome? But that's the best we can do, at least in the medium term, in thinking what's the logic behind doing in-person assessments. It's making sure that students have this baseline of knowledge, understanding, critical thinking that they can then apply in coursework that will look more similar to things they might be doing in research, in careers, et cetera, as they leave university. Alongside this, there still would be coursework, again, depending on the learning outcomes of each individual module. And then for usually optional modules versus the core modules that might include most of these foundational program learning outcomes, there could be a mix of coursework and live assessments. Live assessments could include exams. They could also be presentations with questions and answers at the end, mini vivas that would go along with coursework to ensure that students knew what they were talking about when they submitted the coursework. And then at Durham, we're also saying there can be coursework that allows critical use of generative AI, and then there could be coursework that embeds critical use of generative AI for the sake of developing students' generative AI literacy. Along with all of that would be program-wide literacy development, and literacy in the broadest sense of the word, which includes talking to students about ethical issues, about sustainability of these tools, about when these tools are definitely inappropriate to use, when they cannot be substituted for humans, whether practically or ethically, as well as what's the basics of using these tools. The marking criteria gain importance here because there are a lot of things where when you look at student work and you think there's something wrong, whatever it is, the references exist maybe. It's got, most of these tools have gotten beyond the fake references, but they might not necessarily say what the student is saying that they do. It could be lack of depth in the argument. It could be straying off into other areas that the module didn't cover or that aren't part of the assessment or whatever it is. So we're encouraging people to think about the marking criteria as things that you can use to make sure that students don't get rewarded for using these tools inappropriately. And then, of course, alongside that would be assessment guidance that discourages inappropriate use. So this is just information for you as how Durham is currently looking at this, and how we're going to be approaching it in the next few years anyway. Take it or leave it. So invigilate, definitely when appropriate. The next response then for coursework would be to try to design around these tools. In the short term, this requires a grasp of what the tools can do, and this is still changing and developing. We don't know how much longer it's going to continue developing. If the bubble bursts and the money runs out, we might be near the top already. And that we in academia, we might all be very happy about that. But at the moment, we don't know. So, in the short, medium term, we just have to rely on what we currently know about what these tools can and can't do. But ultimately, in the medium and long term, the viability of this option depends on the learning outcomes. There will be some learning outcomes in our modules that these tools will never be able to accomplish. And if you have learning outcomes like that, you're in a safe place and you can congratulate yourself. If you think that perhaps the learning outcomes for your modules might need to shift a bit to reflect these things, that would be a reasonable response to these tools as well. If these tools can do these things perfectly well, is this a learning outcome that we need to retain? Maybe it's one of those ones that needs to be a core program learning outcome. Or maybe it's something that, well, this might have been a valuable skill in the past, but we don't need to look at it as much going forward. Again, all of these decisions will be complex and really depend on what you're teaching. I won't go into this anymore because we're talking about assessment design, not critical use and literacy today. But just to mention that the next step that these researchers suggest would be to educate students on critical use, which is what I was talking about before, how to use these tools, but also all about the ethics of using these tools, the legitimacy of using these tools, sustainability, all that. Hopefully someday we will understand the potential of these tools, everything will normalize, and we will be able to progress beyond kind of reactionary thinking. So there was no research on this for quite a while, and now there are floods of papers and books coming in about what's the best response where assessment is concerned. Of course, there isn't lengthy empirical research into this because that still isn't possible, but what there is increasing, and most of it is leading toward two main themes. So the first one is perceptible learning value in assessments. This means students look at an assessment and see this is for more than just a mark that's going to let me continue on or get me a 2-1 or a first or something. It's about the assessment helping students learn. Students who are self-motivated and who really want to learn, and they're intrinsically motivated to learn everything you want to teach them. This might just be a case of clarity in assessment to demonstrate to them that yes, this assessment is going to help you fulfill your learning goals for this module and for your program. And they would also be motivated in this sense by choice. So choice of topic in an assessment, maybe choice of a format in assessment, a presentation or a poster or something like that. You might encounter students perhaps who don't have that intrinsic motivation as much as some other students. Some of them might still see perceived learning value in assessments that they see as inherently valuable to others. So this could be as simple as they researched one thing in particular and present it to their seminar group, and other students learn from them. It could be things like making posters that are displayed somewhere, whether online or physically, contributing to a public-facing blog or a website or something like that. Those are a few examples. Obviously, some of those won't apply to your modules, but that's the kind of idea that we're thinking of. And then hopefully not frequently in the Common Awards, but maybe on occasion there might be students who aren't interested in any of that, but they know that when they finish university, they're going off into a career, whether it's in research or in this case in ministry in some way or another. And if they can see the authenticity of an assessment in terms of what they're going to be doing after they leave university that can help to motivate those students to take the assessment seriously as well, and not just see it as some kind of products that they have to sell to you and then you give them a mark. So this is hard to pin down because it's going to be different, not just for every discipline, but probably for every individual module. So these are general guidelines, not necessarily, here's the solution for you. The other huge thing that comes up again and again in the research is assessment as process rather than product. And that does tie in to the first principle, in that the students need to perceive that the assessment has some inherent learning value. But the other side of this is that the marker can see the process that the student has gone through to achieve the assessment products. So I'll move on to questions that you can ask yourself, because hopefully this will demonstrate what I'm talking about. Again, I'm not saying here's what to do, because it will be different for everyone. And for you, a lot of answers to the questions can be no, and that's absolutely legitimate for your own teaching and your own module. But here's some questions to ask. So first of all, before we get into a lot of assessment redesign, would be to ask whether the intellectual work that students needed to do to either craft successful prompts in a generative AI tool and/or to critique output from these tools, would those things sufficiently evidence the learning outcomes? So if it would take the students so much thoughtful, critical work to get out of generative AI something that would get a passing mark in your module, does that mean that they are actually fulfilling the learning outcomes? In some cases, the answer will definitely be no, but in some cases, it's worth thinking about. Similarly, if they just put a prompt in and got something back out of it, would it take them so much of their learning from the module to make this into something that was viably able to be assessed at a passing mark? Maybe that does demonstrate that they have learned what they were meant to be learning. Again, in a lot of cases, that might be no, but it's worth thinking about. The next question is, could elements that refer to opinions, ethical, philosophical, theological positions, module-related experiences, and experiences, could be practice. It also could be a discussion that in a seminar that where two people were taking very different sides and the discussion evolved in an interesting way, or specific module content that isn't widely available on the web that these tools might not have been trained on very well at all. Could these elements be added or be enhanced, especially where the assessment is concerned? So these tools with a lot of prompting can be convinced to take on one position or another. This does involve a lot of work, but they're generally bad at this. They like to give you both sides and be kind of wishy-washy. If you ask, what would Thomas Aquinas say? Well, I don't know, maybe not. So that could be something. Try it out on 2 or 3 different tools. See how well they do. Module-related experiences. It's not very good at writing reflective pieces on detailed things that have happened. So you could ask it to write a reflective piece on a seminar on X. But again, the amount of prompting that the student would have to do to explain to them the discussion that went on in the seminar and what they thought of it and their argument for why they think the way they do would probably demonstrate that they had reflected on that discussion and critically thought about it. So this is more of a design around thing, but it could work in some cases where the AI tools just can't get to the place where the students need to be for your assessment. So again, another question. Where process is concerned, if you're thinking about your current modules without changing the module descriptor, are there existing activities and formative assessments that could feed more directly into the summative assessment? And so again, this is the two-sided thing, both so that the students can see, oh yes, this work I'm doing all the way through the module leads up to the summative. Oh, right, okay, I'm not going to see these things in isolation. I'm going to see them as a progression of my learning. It also means that if you concretize some of these things a little bit, ask students to submit something, maybe you're not marking it necessarily, but just here's a checkpoint. Just submit your thoughts on this so far. Yeah, and then here's a formative. Remember, this formative feeds into the summative. Now you've got the formative. You've got some records that show that the students have had this learning progression. And if you get to the point where you get the summative that looks a little weird or doesn't really fit in with the assessment brief or with the module, you have a trail of what the students have done. If the students haven't submitted anything, then that is evidence in itself that, oh, you don't seem to have been engaging with this module, then you just came up with this assessment. Yeah, let's have a bit of a discussion about that. Learning value, again, how could you demonstrate the value and authenticity to the assessments? And is there any scope for student choice, whether in topic or give them a couple options for the format of the assessment if appropriate? So an example of this might be if you have an essay that's due at the end of the module, and you've got, obviously you wouldn't just have 3 lectures and 1 reading in the whole module, but you would specifically relate some of these things to activities that students would do in the lead up to writing the essay. So for example, you might say, now that you've done this reading, and in this lecture, I've talked to you about the best way to conduct this literature review. Now you're going to write the literature review, and perhaps online or in the next seminar, swap it with another student. They'll give you some informal feedback on your literature review, and then we'll move on. In the seminar, we'll discuss the literature review and discuss how you're going to write your plan for your essay. Then they submit that as a formative assessment. They get marker feedback on that as they would on most formatives. Then maybe there's another lecture, another seminar where you talk about, okay, I've read all your formative plans. Here's some feedback to the whole cohort of things you could do to write your first draft of the essay. Maybe they get peer feedback on that as well. Maybe they just do just submit it as, here's my first draft. You tick it off. Thank you very much. Then another lecture, more details about how they're writing the essay. Maybe they do some self-feedback. Again, that could be something that they submitted as well. Here's my second draft of my essay. Here's my self-feedback. You're not looking at it. You're not marking it necessarily, but you can see that it's there, and they are doing this progression of the assessment they're keeping up. And then, of course, there's the final submission that obviously gets marker feedback as well. So it's the traditional essay. Don't have to change anything about that. It's just adding these little steps in, show the students that this is a learning process in writing an essay, and helping them along, and also helping you to make sure that the students are all keeping up with this. Did something similar at Durham. This is just a quick little case study of iterative coursework. This was in the programs that are aimed at students whose first language isn't English, so they come to Durham over the summer and do an academic writing course to get them up to speed. So if you see there in that portfolio assessment, 20%, 20%, 20%, wouldn't really recommend that for undergraduate and postgraduate students. But maybe, one summative mark for something, that they do in the middle of the module before the final essay. Of course, that would require a change to the module pro forma, so it would be something to think of in years to come. But they had really positive feedback on that. Students felt a lot more confident in what they were doing. They also added some critical digital literacy in, so they taught students a bit about what to do and what not to do with these tools, as well as breaking the essay up. So when you are looking at your module descriptors and thinking maybe you would like to make some changes to the assessments, again, ask questions like, would elements of in-person assessment be appropriate to the learning outcomes? So you might be thinking about in-person assessments like presentations with questions, mini vivas that go along with coursework. Again, this really depends on what you're teaching, so you might be able to get quite creative with this if your group size isn't too big. Or in-person assessment activities. So not the actual assessment, but all the activities they're doing to leading up to the assessment. Could that be in person? And I've got an example and a case study on that I'll talk about in a minute. As far as process is concerned, could the assessment be comprised of different formative and summative components dispersed throughout the module? Could there also be components that you tell the students really clearly, I'm not going to look at this, you're not going to get feedback on this, but this is a checkpoint for you to make sure that you're staying on track. And so you need to submit this on your online platform. If your platform allows it, for example, we use Blackboard, and you can just click one button and email all of the students who didn't submit anything, just reminding them, oh, are you keeping up? Are you okay? Remember, my office hours are this. So it's nothing that's going to penalize them necessarily, but it's another reminder for them to keep on track and another breadcrumb trail for you. And again, for learning value, could you add elements of student choice or other ways to make the assessments visibly more valuable, more authentic to students? So an example here would be you've got some of your module activities there, and the assessments here, there's two summatives, there's a portfolio at the end, there's a presentation in the middle, and then those are filled out with blog posts. So again, for example, students do some reading, you prompt them, okay, now's the time to write your blog post about this reading. Here's the prompt. Then there's a lecture. Again, prompt, write a blog post off the back of this lecture. That could get peer feedback. You could read a few of them and give generic cohort feedback, so it wasn't taking too much of your time. It could be a proper formative where that is their formative feedback, and then you leave it. Then they do their summative presentation, video presentation, or in person that feeds in from what they've done formative work that would get marker feedback. Then they're writing some more blog posts off the back of seminars, lectures, another seminar. Then they go off and do some independent research. Maybe they reflect on the module as a whole. Again, reflect perhaps on individual seminar discussions or whatever they're doing in your module. Maybe they're getting peer feedback on that. And then that's all feeding in to a summative portfolio at the end. Again, this could be done in a lot of different ways, depending on the learning outcomes for your module, what you do already. But this is just an example of another way that you could encourage this process-based assessment in students without laboring yourself with more work. So the final example is a group project that I mentioned before. So For example, let's say you have a seminar or workshop every week. That's 2 hours long. And so for half of that session, you put people in groups to do a group project, group presentation at the end, whatever it is. And every week in the seminar, you give them something they need to complete by the end of the seminar as a group. So that has the benefit of they've got these little bits of the project that they're working on. You can see them working on it in person. You can also answer their questions, make sure the groups are working effectively, if they're getting stuck. A summative poster, for example, in the middle of the module would help spur them along and to share their learning with the other students in the group. And that could get marker feedback as a summative. Then they keep on working, producing the little tasks. At the end, there's a summative assessment. It could be a group mark. It could be an individual mark if that removes some barriers. Again, the students are interacting as they would normally do in a seminar. They're talking about the module. They're talking about the things they're learning. It's just in a smaller group aiming to complete something at the end. The case study here is basically somebody who did essentially that in the business school. He called them micro tasks that the students were doing in groups every week that led up to a final product at the end. It seemed to work very well. He added a formal midpoint check-in, which is why in the example I put a summative poster in the middle, and also feedback from their peers, which was increased the value of that as well. So just some quick examples. These are all really just to get you thinking. I'm not saying that one of these is guaranteed to work for your module specifically. Chances are it might not, but just examples to get you thinking about what you might want to do with your assessment. So definitely open to some questions for me and for what I've been talking about. Please do put it in the chat or turn your mic on. Hopefully your students don't look like the ones in this lovely generative AI picture. But definitely ask any questions you want, and then we'll move on to discussions among yourselves about assessment, and then we can come back at the end for a plenary. But questions, comments for me first. Tom.
I'm pretty convinced by the model that you've outlined. Thank you so much. I'm worried though that it looks like a lot more marking adjacent activities for module leaders. Am I right in that worry, or please allay my worry?
Yeah. I think you would have to be very careful about how you designed it. I think in the first time you ran something like this, it would almost definitely be more work, but that's why I would really encourage you to view it as there's still summative. That's a certain amount of work for the student, which means there's a certain amount of marking for you. There's still a summative, a formative, which is the same amount of marking. All of these other little things that students are doing, either it's strictly peer feedback or it's just something that they are, for example, uploading to your online platform, and you're just, looking, saying, yes, you did it, no, you didn't. You're not reading it. You're not doing any more net marking than you would normally do. So yeah, I think running it the first time, all the effort in redesigning it, setting that up, it would be more workload, but I would really encourage you to think about ways that you could design something like this that in the end would not increase your workload. So there's, depending on the platforms you're using, depending on how many students you have, depending on the type of teaching you do, that would be different for everyone. But I think there are ways to do it, with peer marking or with just saying, yes, you did that bit, tick, let's move on. But yeah, I think inevitably it would be more work than the first time you ran it. Mike?
Yeah, thank you. Just sort of following up on that, I'm thinking more about increased student workload rather than the marking workload. And I guess there the idea is that trying to make sure that all the little tasks genuinely feed into the big existing task.
Yes.
And maybe some redesign of the big existing tasks so that really works. Is that sort of the way of trying to keep the student workload the same?
Yes, definitely. It's making it, also make it clear to the students that this is how you should be working on an essay. You shouldn't be staying up all night the night before it's due. That's not a good model for doing assessment. So part of it is demonstrating to students just how they should approach these kinds of tasks anyway. But yes, I think there would be a danger in giving the students too much workload if it wasn't carefully designed as, well, these are things that students should be doing anyway if they are, whatever it is, writing an essay, doing a group project, anything like that. Yes. It's just making it more visible rather than increasing their workload. Yes, Cynthia, thank you very much for that question. There's a great deal of references at the end of the slides that I'll circulate, and there's also a link to a big collection of research that we've compiled over the past few years. So that's all in the slides at the end. I have to admit that in my job, we try to encourage more pedagogically robust approaches, and a lot of these suggestions are things that we have recommended, but there's a little bit of a stick in the form of generative AI currently, rather than just please people who already struggle to find extra time. But please do this more pedagogically robust thing. Yeah. Elizabeth?
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to get your thoughts on something. I was thinking about the next module that I'm teaching. I had already decided to have a formative assessment that they do really brief presentations in class one day, about halfway through, about what they're planning to write their essay on. And I can see how that would contribute to this process that you're talking to. So that's really helpful. What I'm wondering is, I'm just thinking about both the ethics and the impact of, do you say at the beginning of the module, I've installed these, points along the way. Here's how that helps you. Also, it helps me to be sure that you're not using AI. Is it best to tell them that? I don't know. I'm kind of two minds.
Yeah, I mean, I think transparency is always better than trying to hide things from students. But I think you could paint it more holistically than that. You could include, yes, one of the reasons I'm doing this is to discourage you from using these tools inappropriately. But it's also keeping you on track. It's also helping you to see how your learning has progressed as your assessment improves over the course of the module. You also give them other reasons as well. But yeah, I think I would paint it as, yeah, this is discouraging you from using these tools in an inappropriate way. And if you wanted to introduce, some ideas about, for this particular module, here are some ways that I think are okay to use these tools. Here are some ways to use these tools that will be detrimental to your learning and probably your mark. So yeah, I mean, in my opinion, transparency like that is better than artificially hiding something from the students, especially if they might be inclined to use these tools inappropriately, mentioning in a not negative way that you know exactly what's going on can help as well. Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you. It's very, very interesting and helpful to see what you're suggesting. I wonder, though, whether it would lead us into having assessment-focused teaching, that cumulatively you're working people towards effectively having a piece of work to be marked of whatever form throughout successive weeks, rather than, I mean, I know for a lot of modules, it seems a challenge to fit in that, you know, the varied teaching content on a whole range of topics, many of which won't actually play directly into the final assessment. And I just wonder if you can comment on that kind of dynamic and how to manage that.
Yes, and I think in the examples, it's probably not very clear. I was trying to suggest that there might be 2 or 3 lectures that directly address the summative assessment. There might be 2 or 3 seminars that do the same. There will be some reading throughout that might, and so make those connections for the students, but not necessarily imply that the only reason you should bother with this module is to do the assessment. It's a bit of a tricky one. I mean, if there is choice in topics for the students, then the lectures that relate to what they're doing for the summative might vary for each student, or the readings or the seminars might vary depending on which topics they've chosen to do. But I think one of the ways to look at it is to turn it around and say, well, the assessment is designed to help the students learn. And so doing the assessment throughout the module is part of their learning activities, rather than them looking at it in a more strategic way in terms of, oh, I'm just doing this module so I can produce a product that's going to get a mark at the end. I know that's a bit of a fluffy way of saying it. That's not concrete advice, but I think it'll be different for every module, and coming at it from the perspective of the assessment is to help the students learn, and it's the thread that runs throughout the module, along with all of the other things in the module that are helping them to learn. It's a good place to start from anyway, in terms of perceiving the module. It might be more difficult to translate that into practice, absolutely. Yeah. Helen.
Thanks, Candace. I'm wondering about how you would differentiate these things according to level, because the kind of scaffolding process that you're describing, I can see is really helpful for students at kind of level 4, level 5. But as we're moving to level 7, like, we're assuming students have the capacity for independent long form thought, and that skill, even though AI can probably replicate it, continues to substantially matter. And so I'm just wondering, how would you differentiate these kind of processes at different levels, and what might that look like?
Yeah, I think you would do. I think it might, in my opinion, just off the top of my head, I think it would be more in the what you were actually asking them to do at each checkpoint. So yeah, in the essay example, you probably wouldn't have as many checkpoints as are demonstrated there. And same thing for an undergraduate dissertation, or whatever the case was. But you would still want maybe some more sophisticated ways of the students to demonstrate the progress that they were making. It could be, leading a seminar group based on what they're talking about, rather than just writing about it afterwards. But I think things like presenting to the whole group about what they're researching or something like that would still be legitimate forms. So yeah, it might not be as many little steps, but I still think the principle holds. It would just be a matter of the specific form that they took. depending on the level. But again, yeah, I mean, definitely make an educated choice as far as what your specific module looks like. Oh, sorry, I'm just reading Tom's comment. Oh yeah, definitely that would be an issue with the mini tasks. I think with the individual tasks, like for example, the blog or the lit review or something, might not be as big of a problem if you're giving them the space of, do it anytime during this week. But the group project kind of thing, that would be more challenging for students who are part-timers or with responsibilities outside. So yeah, that might be the kind of thing that you wouldn't really effectively be able to do. Or you might think of creative ways that you could still keep an eye on what the students are doing. For example, they wouldn't have to be in a room doing it in person, but if you just said each week your group has this marker of progression, just give some evidence that your group progressed this way this week or this fortnight. That might still be a valuable way to do it, especially given the nature of the diverse cohort of students. Anything else? Or are you keen to start talking to each other about this now? I think that might be good. I'll give you a slightly more positive but equally disconcerting image to get you going. So yeah, I would suggest, I think we're going to break out into smaller groups in a moment. Any general thoughts you didn't want to tell me, please do share with your group. Anything that you might consider doing this academic year. And then if you're considering changing your module pro forma for the future, I just recommend having a chat about that in the groups. I think Mike was going to set up some.
Yeah, I will.
So first of all, any just general thoughts about the scope of this before you got into your particular modules and assessments that you wanted to share? Okay. It's Keith.
We started with a sort of question of whether this was a good approach one might use in some modules alongside lots of other good approaches, or whether this was kind of the approach one probably ought to be using in quite a lot of modules or most modules, or I guess, is this the approach that one should use in any module where you're not using a live invigilated exam or a conversation, for example?
Did you come to any conclusions, or was it more of a interesting question to mull over in the next few weeks, months, years?
I think more a question to mull over. I think we liked the approach in principle. It was more around the practicalities of doing it and sort of making it. Is it you must redesign your module around this approach, or is it you will sometimes have modules where you could see how this could be a really good learning approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously it's further complicated with all of the different institutions that are involved in all of this decision making.
I think there's one more general thought about AI, but one of the questions we were exploring is to what extent is AI impacting on the way people are thinking and shaping their thoughts, regardless of these. It could still be used to contribute to some of these tasks. And we had an example of someone who looked up who got to try and write a sermon as an example, just to see, and actually ended up not being able to know what
AI, and there were some good things about it that are then drawn in, and what are the implications of that? I think is a different level of question, perhaps, but.
Oh, it's a really crucial question when you're thinking about how students are using these tools to develop their own thinking. If they're using it just because they feel stuck and they want to move one step, is it inadvertently moving them 3 steps in a direction that isn't the best? And do they have enough understanding to realize that that's what's happening and to step back? Alexander?
We were talking about, sorry, do I need to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. We were talking about the impact on use of AI and learning outcomes, because you mentioned at one point in passing, or maybe we don't need certain learning outcomes anymore. But what we actually felt, what we felt very strongly is that oral and written communication skills are a core learning outcome, and for ministers of religion, they're actually core for their work, because you have to write your parish magazine, which you can't farm out to AI because you need to be authentic. And we actually had the same sermon example that came up, and preaching yourself is actually and being authentic in the preaching is one of the core tasks for ministers of religion. So we've got all these things. So if suddenly we say, oh, it's all right, we allow people to use AI to structure their thoughts, that's actually then a really big problem, because it's not just that it's a few steps too far on, but it's one of the core as part of the academic process and any other process, like ministerial process, you should be able to put down clear thoughts, all of the thoughts yourself for your sermon, for example, and then make sure that the sermon has got the right length. Because if in ministry, for example, you say, oh, AI, here are my sermon ideas, and here's the text. And then you write something, and then you get the structure for your sermon, then you write the sermon, but the sermon is twice as long as it's supposed to be. So you say, can you shorten the sermon for me? The outcome is not you anymore. And I think we are the way in which we are being very permissive at the moment. We're actually encouraging that sort of work, which we thought in our group is actually very dangerous.
I think that brings up a few different points. I mean, the first that really comes to mind is that writing is thinking in a lot of ways, and the process of writing, for example, a sermon, is a thinking process, and in a lot of cases, it's also a social process. It's an intersubjective process, and that's the thing that in a case like that, in a lot of other cases of writing as well, needs to be really driven home to the students. I would absolutely agree with that. I think as far as some learning outcomes that might not be needed anymore, I think that would obviously be on a case-by-case basis. I would still imagine that you wouldn't be taking any learning outcomes out of level 1 modules, for example, because even if there are cases where you could use these tools appropriately, you still need to know what good looks like and what good doesn't look like. And if you don't have that knowledge, you can't write well yourself, and you can't examine outputs from the other things, whether it's in terms of writing quality or in terms of if it's telling you the right thing, or if it's giving you a robust argument, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I would definitely say that it could be the case that some learning outcomes might be taken out of some modules, but I wouldn't say across a program there might be outcomes that would just be ignored in the future. I'm sorry, Reverend Hamley, I can't see your first name. You've got your hand up.
Sorry, that's the weird Cambridge thing. Just on the sermon thing, we had an interesting discussion with our staff here about, is it better to have a good sermon written by AI or significantly helped by AI than a bad sermon written by a student we know can't write good sermons? And I'm saying that as a bit of a joke, but for me there is that question of, you know, AI as a tool, and at what point do we say it is appropriate to use a tool to enable you to do your job better, and at what point? So I'm not sure I would want to have a kind of everything or nothing. And I know a lot of clergy who do write their newsletter and their sermons with AI, sadly, and it saddens me, but equally, if somebody is absolutely and utterly overworked and they have the critical ability to reflect on what AI has given them as a start, I wonder whether part of the training that we give our students in the world as it is to say, how do you assess what AI might give you as a start? So not so much, don't use AI, but if you are going to use AI, how do you do it responsibly? And then how do you use your own ability to critically reflect, to use what the tool has given you in the same way as reading a book gives you something?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting point, and I think it might be even down to a case-by-case basis in that, for example, if somebody doesn't have the cultural capital to easily write in the style that is expected in a certain circumstance, they might write a complete piece and then ask generative AI to tweak the style a little bit for this particular occasion, for example. And you know, is that something that, you know, we want students to be able to do themselves, or is it something that we want them to recognize when it's appropriate to do that and when it's not appropriate to do that, for example? Again, that's just one example of many of the things you said could go in a lot of different directions. Absolutely. Any thoughts in particular about assessment tweaks or design changes? Tom?
Yeah, we talked a bit about, and I think RTI operates differently to a couple of the others in our little small breakout room on this. But a short term, maybe a this year and maybe next year short term tweak that might help in discouraging inappropriate use of AI would be to get rid of blind marking. So we're able to detect a student's voice and their authentic ideas more reliably if we know, oh, that's Susan, that's Peter, who has been contributing in classes with such and such an idea. And then if it's completely different, you might have your you know, your antenna more likely to detect inappropriate generative use than if you'd been part of the formative assessment along the way. Does that make sense? So it might be a short or medium term partial fix.
Elizabeth and then Justin?
Yeah, we also discussed the fact that doing the kinds of lots of check-ins and small impersonal assessments, and especially if those are formative, is probably going to obliterate anonymity, at least for the instructor. So that is something that has to be sort of weighed and discussed and entered thoughtfully.
Definitely. Justin?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Tom's point there, because I've got a slight concern. I think he's absolutely right that knowing the students will enable him and others to have suspicions, and so their antennae will be picking up correctly. He's totally right about that. The problem is around making judgments in academic misconduct panels, because if you're going to make a judgment, you might strongly suspect, and frankly be correct, that this student has written this thing with AI because they've said all this stuff that they've never said in a classroom in a tutorial. But if in the academic misconduct panel they're sat there and simply saying, I've never used it, then you've got a problem, because it's incredibly hard to prove it, and the AI Turnitin score on its own is not sufficient evidence. So I'm just saying, following that process through, you will run into problems in the actual panels, even if your suspicions are very high. That's all.
That's absolutely correct. And I think what we're moving toward, at least at Durham, which is, it's different at every institution, so it's doubly or triply problematic for Common Wars in particular, is to avoid panels unless there's pretty substantial proof, but instead opening the doors for, if we think there's some kind of issue here, then you can be called in for an oral defense or for a mini viva or something like that. But again, that's something that's still being considered across higher education with no one solution. So yes, absolutely, that is a challenge. Phil.
Just following that, really, we had an example of that, might have been a year or 2 years ago, where there was seemingly clear evidence of AI being used in terms of structuring the essay and other things like that. And the student had quite clearly adamant that they hadn't done it. But what it transpired had happened was that the student had quite legitimately rung a friend up and said, look, help me think this through. Let's have a chat. This essay just helped me think through what was going on. And out of that conversation came a framework that they thought would help them write it. And that's what they'd done. What they didn't realise was that the friend, before they'd met, had done an AI thing, and they'd got that idea from AI. So that was an interesting one, just to illustrate that point. Yeah.
And I think, again, that asks a bigger question, which there's no easy answer to either, about the transparency of the assessment process or lack thereof, where the students sometimes feel like they have to hide everything, not just generative AI use, but all of their struggles with coping with understanding what they're meant to be doing in the essay and developing it and coming up against barriers. They have to hide all that and just produce this end product. And so I think that does illustrate another kind of issue with the student perception of what assessment means as a learning process versus a product.
Well, I think we've reached 11:30, so which brings us to the end of our time. But thank you, Candace, so much for that, getting a conversation going. We've been talking about AI and academic misconduct for a while, but not really about this more positive stuff about strategies for assessment. So it's been really tremendously helpful. And I'm sure this conversation is going to continue across Common Awards. We do have another webinar in March where we'll be coming back to the misconduct policy to see how it's all going over the year. So if you're interested in that side of things, please do come to that webinar as well. But please do all, in whatever electronic way is appropriate, say thank you at this point to Candace for a really fantastic session. We are much in your debt.
Thank you very much.